All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to pick up where we left off last time and talk a little bit about the ethics of photojournalism. And just the same heads up that I gave last time, I will give this time. Some of the images that we will look at as a part of this presentation today do involve mature situations, and they do involve death. So I just want to give a heads up on that. Okay, as we move forward. Our last conversation was primarily about how photojournalists behave as working photojournalists in the field, right? It's about how we deal with difficult situations, how we deal with our own mental stability, how we deal with situations where we may be taking photographs of sensitive scenarios, funerals, deaths, that kind of thing. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the aspect of publishing. So after we get done out in the field and we have to make these decisions about where are we going to run these photographs that might be mature content or might be sort of difficult things to look at, how do we put those appropriately in publication? And we're sort of left again with a strange gray area, right? Like there is no thing we can specifically point to that tells us exactly what to do in these situations. Like we have the Society of Professional Journalists, we have SPJ with their big leading thing being to minimize harm. And they talk about the balance, needing to balance the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort. And how we balance that, right? It doesn't actually tell us what to do. It just says we have to consider the balance between these two things. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about in terms of publishing photographs today. And this almost always ends up being about death. Death is the topic that comes up when we talk about this, and it's something that is happening more and more lately as working photojournalists are taking pictures of the COVID-19 crisis. They find themselves having to ask themselves and their editors, hey, when and how do we take pictures of people who have passed away? And how do we publish those? How do they contribute to the story? And all of this demonstrates the power of photographs, right? Journalists can write about death in situations all day long and have very little conversation with their editors about describing a dead body. But as soon as you include a photograph, then it becomes a conversation where you have to talk to your editor and you have to look at what your company or the people that you're writing for's guidelines are for this kind of thing, or who you're taking pictures for. A lot of sites and publications have their own rules. Some will say that you cannot have any bodies at all that are of a dead person. Some of them say you can't have identifiable human parts. Some of them will have rules that say no blood. When I was working at a newspaper in the Seminole Chronicle, there was a situation where someone was found dead behind a restaurant. And our personal rule when we were running the story about it was no identifiable human parts. So a sheet was draped over the person who was laying dead behind the restaurant. It was a suicide in this situation. And the photographer had to sort of physically move themselves around to get the angle of the shot because the person's leg was sticking out from under the sheet that they had draped over the dead body. The police had draped the sheet over the body. And so the leg sticking out broke the rule. So the photographer had to find a different angle to make that shot work for us to be able to use it, both online and in the paper, because that was the line that we chose to draw in the sand. We will not run photographs of dead people that have identifiable human body parts. And so the best thing we have to do when we're looking at examples of this is to look at past case studies. Just like we did last time with the difference between Nick Utt and Kevin Carter, we're going to look at some differences of when publications made decisions on how and when to publish things. So going back to the 1960s, RFK, Robert Kennedy, the brother of JFK, was running for president. This is after JFK had been assassinated. And RFK, Robert Kennedy, was also shot while campaigning in California. The photographer who was there is a photographer named Boris Yarrow. He was a longtime LA Times staff photographer, and he happened to be there the night that Robert Kennedy was shot, and he snapped some now very famous photographs of Robert Kennedy laying on the ground after being shot. And keep in mind contextually the timeline for this stuff. This is only 5 years after JFK, his brother, was shot and killed in Dallas. It's 2 months after Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis. And so assassinations were very much a thing that the American public was dealing with emotionally and thinking about. They were fresh in people's mind. And so here was another one. Here was another political assassination that was happening and did happen. And so a lot of newspapers had this debate. Back in the day, this was just a newspaper debate because there really was no cable news, and television news was not going to run these images on prime time. And so there was a running debate with newspaper folks, which is running the photographs that Yarrow took okay, or is it going to do more harm than good by running it? Right? Are you going to upset people more by running the photograph in a way that is unnecessary because they're going to get the same information by reading it? And this has historically been a part of what we call the breakfast test. Newspapers have had to follow this very informal rule set called the breakfast test, where it is not to put anything that would cause somebody to get too emotionally upset over breakfast, right? It's first thing in the morning, go get the newspaper, have a cup of coffee, have breakfast. And if it's going to make you lose your appetite, it's going to make you upset first thing in the morning, then you don't want to run it. But this is a very big monumental thing that occurred. You can't just ignore it. So the Los Angeles Times being the closest, because this did occur in Southern California, they ran the photographs. They even ran arguably some of the not quite the most graphic, but still pretty graphic photographs on their front page with the very large headline, "Kennedy shot." The New York Times actually chose to go with the even more graphic photograph, which is Robert Kennedy on the ground with medics around him by the time that doctors had gotten there, with his shirt open. And you could, even though it was black and white, you could get a sense that there was quite a bit of blood in the image. Whereas some other newspapers, like the Eugene Register Guard, which is the big paper in Eugene, Oregon, they chose not to run the shooting photographs and instead ran a stock photograph of RFK from previously in his political career. And so the conclusion we can draw from this case study is that monumentally historic events, right, like a presidential candidate and brother of someone who was assassinated themselves getting shot and killed, that's going to give more wiggle room for publishing difficult photos of dead bodies, people dying, blood, right? The photographs of Robert Kennedy on the ground dying, particularly the ones where you can tell that he's been bleeding quite a bit, those aren't things that's not a picture we would normally run in a newspaper on the front page. But because it was such a monumental thing, because if we think of news value and newsworthiness, prominence being such a big deal in this situation, that it gives us more freedom to say, all right, we know this is mature content, but it's historical mature content that people need to see. All right, let's move on to another case study. This is actually one where we have just passed the 25th anniversary of it earlier this month. In April 1995, Timothy McVeigh detonated a car bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, and 168 people died. And of those 168 people, a lot of them were small children, because there was a daycare built into the building so that employees of the building could drop their kids off and pick their kids up at the same building where they worked. And the daycare was located very close to where McVeigh parked the truck and where it exploded, so it killed a lot of kids. And it was a huge thing. It was, a lot of you were, this happened well before you were born, but it was, at the time, it was the biggest news story. Like, it was, everything sort of shut down for a while. Kind of, obviously not nearly as big as the COVID-19 stuff we're going through now, but it had that level of air to it. Like, it was such a big thing. Everyone was stopped what they were doing and found television to watch the news when this happened. And as a part of this, a firefighter named Chris Fields in Oklahoma City, as a first responder, he's digging through the rubble and he pulls a 1-year-old child out of the debris. Firefighter pulls the body, and sort of walks over to police officers to hand the body of the child off to the police officers. And they're hard to look at photographs, but they are well known now. They're very prominent, right? So this is the main photograph. This is the other photograph from a slightly different angle. And then this is the one from the side as he is handing the child off to the police officer. And the child did die. From the time he picked the child up from the rubble and walked the child over to the police officers, the child did die. And the photograph itself was taken by an amateur photographer named Charles Porter IV. Did not work as a photojournalist, was just a guy who bought a camera and liked to dabble with it occasionally and tried to make money off of it if he could. He was actually at the time a clerk at a bank and was trying to get a job as a photojournalist, or was thinking about it. And so when he heard what was happening, or in this case, I think he was close enough to actually feel the explosion when it went off, he got his camera and ran to the scene to try to take pictures. Pulled this from a thing that was written about this whole situation. The tragedy took place before the age of cell phones and instant cameras, and Charles Porter IV took this photo to a nearby Walmart to have it developed. A friend, moved by what he saw, encouraged Porter to submit it to the Associated Press. Porter thought the local paper might run it. Instead, the image traveled across the world. This ended up being the photograph that represented the Oklahoma City bombing. Again, a lot of you, I think, only know of that incident as a very historical thing, but for people like me, it was the thing that happened. It was such a shocking event. And there was once again this huge debate about what to do with this photograph. Photojournalists and photo editors at papers across the country had to decide how and when are we going to use this photograph, because it's got essentially a dead body on the front of it, and it's a heart-wrenching photograph to look at. The newspaper in Oklahoma City, the Daily Oklahoman, they chose to run it, but they ran it what we call below the fold, right? So if you're looking at a newspaper like this, if it was folded up on a newsstand, you wouldn't see the image until you unfolded it. They didn't make it large and prominent. They kept it small at the bottom, and they decided to go with a different photograph for the top of the newspaper. That's something that a lot of papers would follow with. The New York Times did the same thing. The Detroit News did the same thing, where they took some of those images from Porter, but they used them in smaller size, and they used them below the fold. New York Times chose to use the side photograph. The Detroit News chose to use the more famous straightforward photograph. The Daily News also actually took it and cropped the firefighter out of it and took only the police officer with a very distasteful headline, because that's what the New York Daily News does. But some papers like the Sacramento Bee in Sacramento, California, actually decided actively not to use it. They did not want to use the photograph. They said, we viewed it as a picture of a corpse, and even though there was no information about the baby's condition, it was the most dramatic photo and very compelling, but we chose to go with a photo of a live child rather than a dead one. Their whole thing was, look, our rule is no dead bodies. We believe that child is dead, and they were correct in that, and therefore we are not going to use that image. Interestingly, back in the day when the weekly news magazines were still very much a thing, Time magazine ended up choosing to go with the photograph in small instead of very large, because by the time the episode or the issue came out, they had already caught who had done it, and they used his photograph as the main one. Newsweek, however, chose not to use the photograph of the perpetrator, and instead use what they believed was a true representation of the victims of the terrorist attack. And with no headline either, just the headline being the place and date at the very top. The photographer, Charles Porter IV, would go on to win the 1996 Pulitzer Prize for spot photography, which we know now is breaking news photography, which is a pretty big deal for the fact that he was not a professional photojournalist. He was a guy working at a bank who just happened to like photography a lot, and he won the Pulitzer Prize. And the conclusion that we can draw from this case study is that when dealing with emotionally sensitive photographs, context and taste are going to be very important. when you use the image, it's not just about the decision to use it or not. It's if you're going to use it, where are you going to put it? What kind of headline are you going to match with it? Are you going to use it small below the fold, or are you going to blow it up and make it large above the fold? So this brings us back to the world of today, where we're faced with the exact same issues. About 12, this is a new case study from a couple of years ago, about 12 refugees who had been attempting to cross the Mediterranean into coast of Greece drowned after their raft sank, and the bodies washed ashore on an island in Turkey. So this was during the migrant crisis out of Syria and into trying to get into Europe. And one of the bodies that washed up was a very small child. A photographer was there and snapped the pictures. And this ended up being sort of one of the big shocking photographs to come from this incident, which is a child who had drowned and had washed up on shore. There was another photograph that went along with it that was also used that shows the police officer here picking the body of the child up. But in this case, you can still see that it is a dead child, but you can't see the child's face, which does take some of the impact of it out. The photos broke first on social media. They were shared a lot on Twitter and on Facebook, which left traditional news wondering how they should approach them and use them. So even though a lot of people had already seen the photographs, unlike the other two examples we've looked at, in this case, people have already seen the photographs. So news has to now decide, how are we effectively as journalists going to use this? Do they choose to run the more jarring photo of the child face down in the sand, or do they choose to use the one where the face is obscured being carried off by the official, or do they choose not to use any at all? And it was really split. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Baltimore Sun, they chose to use the one where the face was obscured, whereas the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Globe and Mail, which is a very large newspaper out of Canada, they chose to use the face down photograph. And the assistant managing editor at the Los Angeles Times, Kim Murphy, had this to say about her decision to run the most intense of the photographs, which is, the image is not offensive, it's not gory, and it's not tasteless. It's merely heartbreaking and a stark testimony of an unfolding human tragedy that is playing out in Syria, Turkey, and Europe, often unwitnessed. We've written stories about hundreds of migrants dead in capsized boats, sweltering trucks, lonely rail lines, but it took a tiny boy on a beach to really bring it home to those readers who may not yet have grasped the magnitude of the migrant crisis. So her whole thing was, look, this is a huge deal, what is happening, and people aren't paying attention to it. So if this photograph can get people to pay attention to what's happening, then that is a useful photograph. Like it is going to bring more good to the world by publishing it than it will bring harm. Even the digital world was sort of split, right? Both of those we've looked at already have been traditional newspapers, but BuzzFeed News and Vox were split. BuzzFeed News chose to run the photographs. Vox said, no, we're not going to run any of them. They actually said, was from Max Fisher, their editorial director, said, I understand the argument for running the photograph as a way to raise awareness and call attention to the severity of the refugee crisis, and I don't begrudge outlets that did. But I ultimately decided against running it because the child in that photo cannot consent to becoming a symbol. That was his main argument, is that this child will now become a symbol for the migrant crisis, and that child did not consent to that and never could have understood the weight of what they were going to be turned into after dying. Some publications, like the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, ran the images blurred or with a sort of censor blur over them. And they as well also ran it with a warning, which was that the story contains graphic photographs of a young boy who died, images some viewers might find disturbing. And they also took the photographs and they embedded them at the very bottom of the story so that you saw the warning and you weren't just immediately faced with it. It was, here's the warning, scroll down if you want to see them, that's where they are. And so the conclusion is adding content warnings to difficult photographs, especially ones that involve death and violence and difficult subjects, is a good idea. Content warnings are a good way for us to still be able to give readers and viewers the impact of the photographs we're taking, but not necessarily do it in a way that can be shocking. Like give the viewer a chance to guard themselves first. Okay, so I know a lot of that stuff we were looking at is not the easiest stuff to look at in the world, but hopefully you can consider the lessons that come from it, because if you're ever in that situation, you'll want to have these case studies to fall back on. All right, see you next time.